It was a bright, sunny afternoon, and James Carter was driving home after a long day. Dressed in a sharp navy blue suit, he looked forward to unwinding with his family. James was a man of calm demeanor and sharp intellect, known for his ability to lead with fairness and respect. What many didn't know was that James had recently been appointed as the new captain of the local police precinct, ready to bring positive change to the force. As James drove through a quiet suburban street, he noticed flashing lights in his rearview mirror. A police car was signaling him to pull over. Confused, James calmly slowed down and parked on the side of the road. He rolled down his window, prepared to comply with whatever the officer asked. Officer Rick Peterson, a man with a reputation for being short-tempered and brash, stepped out of the patrol car. His partner, Officer Daniels, stayed in the car, observing. Rick walked over to James's car, his face tight with irritation. "License and registration," Rick barked, not bothering with a greeting. James remained calm, reaching for his wallet. "Is there a problem, officer?" he asked politely. Rick narrowed his eyes, looking James up and down. "You tell me," he replied sharply. "What's a guy like you doing driving a car like this in this neighborhood?" James paused for a moment, catching the undertone in Rick's words. Still, he kept his composure. "I'm just heading home," he said, handing over his license and registration. Rick glanced at the documents but didn't really look at them. "Step out of the car," he ordered. James raised an eyebrow. "May I ask why?" Rick's tone grew harsher. "Don't ask questions. Just do as I say." Not wanting to escalate the situation, James stepped out of the car. A small group of bystanders had begun to gather at a distance, sensing that something wasn't right. Rick stood inches away from James, glaring at him as if daring him to protest. "You think you're better than everyone, don't you?" Rick sneered, his voice dripping with contempt. "Well, I don't care who you think you are." James took a deep breath, his patience wearing thin, but his calm demeanor intact. "Officer, I believe there's been a misunderstanding," he said evenly. "I haven't done anything wrong." Rick, clearly agitated, suddenly lashed out, punching James in the chest. The blow wasn't hard enough to knock James down, but it was enough to shock everyone watching. Gasps rippled through the small crowd as Rick's partner stepped out of the car, looking alarmed. James straightened his suit jacket, his face calm but his eyes sharp. "I was hoping this wouldn't go this far," he said quietly. Reaching into his jacket pocket, he pulled out a badge. "I'm Captain James Carter, your new commanding officer." Rick froze, his face draining of color. The bystanders, many of whom recognized James, stared in stunned silence. The atmosphere shifted as everyone realized the gravity of what had just happened. The air was heavy with silence after James revealed his badge. Officer Rick Peterson stood frozen, his face pale as he realized the mistake he had just made. The crowd, which had been murmuring moments before, was now completely quiet. All eyes were on James and Rick. James, still calm and composed, tucked his badge back into his jacket. He looked at Rick directly, his voice steady but firm. "Is this how you treat people, Officer Peterson? Is this how you represent the badge?" Rick stammered, unable to find the right words. His partner, Officer Daniels, stepped forward cautiously, clearly uneasy about what had just happened. "Captain, I didn't know," Rick blurted out. "I thought—" "You thought what?" James interrupted, his voice sharper now. "That I didn't belong here. That you could intimidate me without cause, or that no one would question your behavior." The crowd began to whisper again, some recording the moment on their phones. James turned to them and raised a hand. "Please, everyone, remain calm," he said, addressing the onlookers. "This situation will be handled properly." Rick's partner looked visibly nervous, glancing between James and Rick. "Captain Carter, I think we should move this conversation to a more private setting," Daniels suggested quietly. James nodded. "You're right. Let's head to the precinct. Officer Peterson, follow me." Rick hesitated, clearly dreading what awaited him at the station. "Yes, sir," he mumbled, his voice barely above a whisper. The once confident officer now looked small and unsure. James walked to his car and sat inside, taking a deep breath before starting the engine. He wasn't angry, he was disappointed. As a leader, he believed in fairness and integrity, values he had worked hard to uphold throughout his career. What Rick had done wasn't just a mistake, it was a breach of trust, one that reflected poorly on the entire force. The drive to the precinct was short, but it felt long for Rick. His mind raced as he thought about the consequences of his actions. Meanwhile, James remained calm, thinking about how to address the situation without letting emotions take over. This wasn't just about him. It was about setting a standard for everyone in the department. When they arrived at the precinct, James instructed both Rick and Daniels to follow him into his office. The other officers in the building watched with curiosity, some already aware of what had happened thanks to the viral videos spreading online. Inside the office, James closed the door and gestured for Rick and Daniels to sit. "Before we begin, let me make one thing clear," James said, his tone steady. "This is not about revenge. This is about accountability." Rick nodded, his head hanging low. Daniels, though silent, seemed relieved that the captain's approach was fair and professional. James continued, "Officer Peterson, I want you to explain your actions today. Not to me, but to yourself. Because if you can't, then you're in the wrong profession." Rick swallowed hard, realizing there was no escaping the truth. The process of accountability had begun. Inside James's office, the atmosphere was tense. Officer Rick Peterson sat stiffly in his chair, his hands clasped tightly together, avoiding eye contact. His partner, Officer Daniels, looked uncomfortable but remained silent, glancing occasionally at James, who stood tall and composed. James took a seat behind his desk, folding his hands calmly as he addressed Rick. "Officer Peterson," he began, his voice steady but firm, "what exactly was going through your mind during today's incident?" Rick hesitated, his face red with shame. I thought he... Rick stopped himself, realizing how weak his excuse would sound. He took a deep breath. "I thought you were just another guy trying to act important," he said quietly, his voice barely audible. James raised an eyebrow. "Just another guy? What made you think that? Was it my suit? My car? Or something else?" His tone was pointed but not angry. Rick's head dropped lower. He didn't answer. James leaned forward slightly, his expression serious. "I need you to be honest with me, officer. Because if you can't explain your actions, how can you expect anyone else to trust you to do your job?" The silence in the room was deafening. Finally, Rick spoke, his voice trembling. I misjudged you. I let my assumptions get the better of me." "Misjudged," James repeated, his tone calm but challenging. "You didn't just misjudge me, Officer Peterson. You escalated a situation unnecessarily. You punched someone, your new commanding officer, no less, without cause. Is that how you handle all interactions with the public?" Rick's face turned pale. "No, sir," he said quickly. "It's not. I made a mistake. A big one." James nodded slowly. "Yes, you did. And do you know what makes this mistake worse? You represent this department. Every badge you wear, every uniform you put on, is a symbol of trust. And today, you broke that trust, not just with me, but with the community." Rick's hands shook slightly as he absorbed James's words. Daniels, sitting beside him, finally spoke up. "Captain Carter," he said cautiously, "I think Rick knows what he did was wrong. But I also think he needs to understand the impact of his actions beyond this room." James nodded, appreciating Daniels's input. "You're absolutely right, Officer Daniels," he said. He turned back to Rick. "Here's what's going to happen. You will be placed on administrative leave while we conduct an internal review of today's events. During that time, you will attend training sessions on de-escalation and bias awareness. And if you want to remain on this force, you will have to prove that you can uphold the values we stand for." Rick swallowed hard, nodding. "Yes, sir. I understand." James leaned back in his chair, his tone softening slightly. "Mistakes happen, Officer Peterson, but how you respond to them defines who you are. I hope you take this opportunity to reflect and grow." Rick nodded again, his voice quiet. "Thank you, Captain." As Rick and Daniels left the office, James looked out the window, deep in thought. This was only the beginning of the changes he needed to bring to the precinct. The news of the incident between Officer Rick Peterson and Captain James Carter spread quickly through the precinct. By the end of the day, nearly everyone had heard the story, and the viral videos from bystanders outside only made things worse. Officers whispered in the hallways, their conversations filled with shock and curiosity. Many of them respected James's leadership style, but hadn't expected him to handle the situation with such calm and control. James, however, was not focused on the chatter. He had bigger priorities, restoring trust within the department and the community. That evening, he called an emergency meeting with the entire precinct. Every officer was required to attend, including those who were off duty. The meeting room filled quickly, with officers sitting in chairs, standing along the walls, and even crowding near the door. James entered the room and stood at the front, his presence commanding but not intimidating. He looked around, meeting the eyes of his officers. The room fell silent, the tension thick in the air. "Good evening," James began, his voice steady and clear. "I called this meeting because what happened earlier today was not just an incident. It was a reflection of something deeper, something we must address as a team." He paused, letting his words sink in before continuing. "As officers, we hold a position of trust. The badge we wear represents more than authority. It represents responsibility, respect, and service. When one of us fails to uphold those values, it affects all of us." James scanned the room, seeing a mix of expressions, some nodding in agreement, others looking uneasy. "I want to make one thing clear. I am not here to tear anyone down, but I am here to make sure we hold ourselves to the highest standard. That means acknowledging our mistakes and working to fix them." He took a deep breath and continued. "Earlier today, I experienced something that too many people in our community experience. An unnecessary escalation based on assumptions. That cannot happen in this department. It cannot happen on my watch." The room was completely silent now, the officers listening intently. James's words were firm but not accusatory, striking a balance between leadership and understanding. "To ensure this doesn't happen again," James said, "I'm implementing new training programs for everyone, from rookies to senior officers. These programs will focus on de-escalation, community engagement, and recognizing personal biases. We are also establishing a new system for accountability, so incidents like today are addressed immediately." He stepped forward, his voice softening. "I know change is hard. I know some of you might feel uncomfortable with these changes, but I ask you to trust me. Together, we can build a department that not only enforces the law, but also earns the respect of the community we serve." As James finished, the room was quiet for a moment before officers began clapping. It started with just a few, then spread until the entire room was applauding. James nodded, feeling a sense of hope. This was just the beginning, but he knew they were on the right path. The days following the meeting were busy for Captain James Carter. True to his promise, he began implementing changes in the precinct. The first step was introducing the new training programs. James brought in experienced trainers to lead workshops on de-escalation techniques, cultural sensitivity, and recognizing biases. Every officer, no matter how long they had been on the force, was required to attend. At first, some of the senior officers grumbled about the changes. "Why do we need this?" one officer muttered to another. "I've been doing this job for 20 years without a problem." But James didn't back down. He knew change wouldn't happen overnight, but he believed it was necessary. Officer Rick Peterson, who had been placed on leave, was among the first to attend the training. At the sessions, he listened quietly, taking notes and reflecting on his actions. The trainers didn't sugarcoat the lessons. They used real-life examples, including incidents similar to what had happened between Rick and James. Slowly, Rick began to see how his behavior had been influenced by assumptions and a lack of self-awareness. Meanwhile, James worked on rebuilding trust with the community. He organized town hall meetings, inviting residents to share their concerns and suggestions. At the first meeting, held in a local community center, dozens of people showed up, some angry, some hopeful. James stood at the front of the room, listening carefully to every story and idea. One woman, an older resident named Mrs. Thompson, stood up and said, "Captain Carter, I've lived in this neighborhood for 30 years, and I've seen too many good people treated unfairly. What makes you different? How do we know this isn't just talk?" James looked her in the eye and replied, "Because I'm not here to make promises I can't keep. I'm here to listen, to learn, and to act. And I'll prove that through my actions, not just my words." His sincerity won over many in the room, and by the end of the meeting, people were shaking his hand and thanking him for taking the time to hear them out. Slowly but surely, the community began to see James as a leader they could trust. Back at the precinct, the changes were starting to show. Officers who had once resisted the new training programs were beginning to approach their jobs differently. They learned how to de-escalate tense situations without resorting to force. They started building better relationships with the people in the neighborhoods they patrolled. One afternoon, Officer Daniels approached James in his office. "Captain, I just wanted to say, thank you," he said. "I didn't realize how much I had to learn until now." James smiled. "We all have something to learn, Daniels. The important thing is that we're willing to grow." As Daniels left, James felt a sense of accomplishment. The precinct was far from perfect, but progress was being made. And for James, that was the first step toward real change. Weeks turned into months, and the changes in the precinct became more noticeable. Captain James Carter's leadership was making a real difference. The officers who once resisted his ideas began to see the results of the new training programs. Calls that would have escalated in the past were now handled calmly and professionally. Complaints from the community decreased, and respect for the police force slowly grew. One of the biggest transformations was in Officer Rick Peterson. After completing his training sessions, Rick was a different man. He approached his job with more thoughtfulness and care. He even took it upon himself to mentor younger officers, sharing the lessons he had learned about making assumptions and treating people with respect. One afternoon, James called Rick into his office. Rick entered, his posture straighter than before, but his expression humble. "Captain, you wanted to see me?" he asked. James nodded, gesturing for Rick to sit down. "Yes, Officer Peterson. I wanted to talk about your progress." Rick sat down, his hands resting on his knees. "I know I made a big mistake, sir," he said honestly. "But I've been trying my best to learn from it. And I can see that," James replied. "You've taken responsibility for your actions, and that's not something everyone is willing to do. I've noticed the effort you've put into your work, and it hasn't gone unnoticed." Rick let out a small sigh of relief. "Thank you, sir. I appreciate that." James leaned forward slightly, his tone serious but kind. "Rick, it's not just about doing better for yourself. It's about setting an example for others. This precinct needs leaders who can show the younger officers how to do this job the right way. And I believe you can be one of those leaders." Rick's eyes widened slightly. You think I can lead, sir?" James nodded. "I do. But leadership isn't just about rank or authority. It's about earning trust, taking responsibility, and treating everyone with dignity, both inside and outside this building." Rick nodded, his voice steady. "I understand, Captain, and I'm ready to do my part." Later that week, James held another town hall meeting with the community. This time, Rick joined him, standing at the front of the room alongside other officers who had completed the training. When James invited the community to ask questions, Rick was the first to step forward and speak. "I know I've made mistakes," Rick said, his voice steady but sincere. "But I want you to know that I'm committed to doing better, for you and for this community." The crowd was quiet for a moment before a few people started clapping. Soon, the applause grew louder. Rick looked at James, who gave him a small nod of encouragement. As the meeting ended, James felt a sense of pride. The precinct was far from perfect, but it was moving in the right direction. And for James, seeing officers like Rick transform into better versions of themselves was the greatest reward of all. Months later, the precinct had transformed into a place of growth, learning, and trust. Captain James Carter's leadership was the heart of this change. His focus on fairness and accountability had inspired not only the officers under his command, but also the community that had once felt alienated and unheard. One sunny afternoon, James walked through the neighborhood. He wore a simple jacket, blending in with the locals, rather than standing out as the precinct captain. Children played on the sidewalks, their laughter filling the air. People waved at him as he passed, some even stopping to chat. "Captain Carter," a woman called out, rushing up to him. It was Mrs. Thompson, the elder who had spoken at the first town hall meeting. "I just wanted to thank you. Things feel so much better around here now. We feel safer, and the officers treat us with respect." James smiled warmly. "Thank you, Mrs. Thompson. That means a lot. But this isn't just about me. It's about all of us working together to make things better." As he continued walking, James saw a patrol car pull over by the curb. Officer Rick Peterson stepped out and approached a group of teenagers who were sitting on the steps of a store. James watched from a distance, curious to see how Rick handled the situation. "Hey guys," Rick said, his tone friendly and calm. "How's it going?" The teens looked up, a little wary at first. "We're just hanging out," one of them replied. "That's fine," Rick said with a smile. "I just wanted to remind you to keep the area clean. The shop owner gets nervous when there's too much trash around." One of the teens nodded. "Yeah, we'll make sure to clean up before we leave." "Thanks," Rick said, giving them a thumbs up. "Take care." As Rick got back into his car, James approached him. "Good job, Officer Peterson," he said. "That's exactly how we build trust." Rick smiled, his expression grateful. "Thanks, Captain. I've learned a lot from you. It feels good to do things the right way." James nodded, patting him on the shoulder. "Keep it up. You're setting an example." Back at the precinct, James gathered his team for a meeting. He stood at the front of the room, looking at the officers who had grown so much under his leadership. "I want to thank all of you," he began. "The work we've done here isn't easy, but it's worth it. You've shown this community that we're here to serve and protect, not to intimidate or harm." The officers clapped, their faces filled with pride. For James, this was the greatest reward, seeing his team become a force for good. As the day ended, James sat in his office, reflecting on how far they had come. The precinct had faced challenges, but through accountability, respect, and determination, they had turned things around. James knew there was still work to do, but he was ready for whatever came next. And this time, he knew his team would be ready too.